Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, and welcome to Islamic at Authors. This is a sort of weekly session that I have where I meet usually with actual authors of the works that I'm going to discuss, and today we have a kind of exceptional session where I'll be having a discussion with the son of an author. Both of them are Shaykh, I guess. So Shaykh al-Dr. Abdullah Alaoudh, the son of Shaykh al-Dr. Salman Al-Ouda. And it really gives me immense pleasure to introduce Abdullah Alaoudh. He's founder, or one of the founders, of something called Dawn, which is a democracy in the Arab world now. You can correct me if I'm misreading any of this at all. And a visiting adjunct professor at the Elliott School of George Washington University, as well as a fellow of the Yaqeen Islamic Institute. So Dr. Abdullah is someone who's obviously originally trained in Saudi Arabia, did a law degree, I believe at Qasim University, before going to the University of Pittsburgh, pursuing an LLM and then an SJD, basically a doctorate in the law specifically. And so it really is an immense pleasure to invite you, and you have to forgive me, I've not yet systematically read through your dissertation. Perhaps that's something that we can discuss at some point in the future, because it's actually related to a lot of these sorts of themes that we're about to discuss today. But I am a great fan of your father's work. And your father, I should introduce, however briefly, is Shaykh Salman Al-Ouda, one of the most important and most noted scholars in Saudi Arabia of our time, really. And he's someone who is noteworthy as one of the Sahwi scholars from the 1990s, and he spent time in prison for, at that point, he was quite young, I assume, at the time, but in his youth, basically calling for greater accountability of government. And now, 20, 30 years later, he finds himself again imprisoned, and we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and yu'ajjil lahu al-faraj that he's released soon. But he's a scholar who finds himself in prison really because of his advocacy for the freedoms of people in the Arab world and for democracy and on an Islamic basis. And this is what's really so amazing about your father, someone who doesn't see a sort of any conflict between having that accountable government and having an Islamic society. So I look forward to discussing his book As'ilat al-Thawra. We were just having a brief discussion about how to translate As'ilat al-Thawra. I was saying it could be the questions of the revolutions, or the revolution that was ongoing. But in a sense, al-Thawra here is just revolution as a category. So it's questions of revolution, like when it comes to the nature of revolution, how do we deal with these things? And so with that brief introduction, let me just give a sense of the format for our viewers and for yourself, if that's all right, Shaykh Abdullah. So we'll, inshallah, allow you to maybe speak about your father's work for about 10 to 15 minutes, give us an overview of this particular book, and if you think it's relevant, bringing in sort of aspects of his own personal life. This is really an opportunity and an insight that you can offer that others cannot. And then perhaps we can extend beyond that to sort of a broader discussion that will also allow for, and I'd like to alert everyone, particularly those watching on Facebook and YouTube, that your comments in the chat will be something that we can respond to. So we'll try and address those in the last 15 minutes. So about 15 minutes now, 10-15 minutes for Shaykh Abdullah, and then a discussion. Hopefully I will have about half an hour with you. And I understand you're a bit limited on time, so we'll conclude in an hour roughly. So the last 15 minutes we can take any questions, inshallah. And if I may, inshallah, we look forward to having you over again at some point in the near future.
Yeah, inshallah, absolutely. Thank you so much, first of all, for having me. I've always been a great fan also of your work, what you do. Yeah, I follow you and what you write, and it is actually an honor and pleasure to be part of this.
The honor is all mine.
Thank you. So for the book, as you said, I remember the first moments actually when he was thinking about the revolutions in the Arab world during the Arab Spring. It was, you can say, it was kind of part of the process. I remember translating a lot of works for my father to read in preparation for the book. He asked me a lot of questions. He read a lot of work. I mean, he's actually, as you know, and a lot of listeners and watchers know for now that he's well versed in Islamic history, Islamic work, and Islamic jurisprudence. But
roughly how many books has he written?
So the books that he republished were about like 14 or 15 books that are that ranges like one book like Sharh Mukhtasar Muslim is like a 4-volume book. That's just one book, and then also we have small books like the one that we are discussing, which is questions of the revolution or of the revolutions, which is like a really small book. So yeah, and then the thing is that he asked me to translate some of the works of, for example, I remember Hannah Arendt, Revolutions. Believe it or not, he also was interested in everything that was said in English about revolutions, like definition and the root of the word and how it developed. He was interested in how the concept revolution also developed in the West. He was interested a lot also in understanding the context and the root of the what we know in Arabic as a dawla diniya, or you can say a theocracy or the theocratic system, and whether that and how that was really contextualized in the sense that it was produced from the European kind of experience and all that. And you can see when you read his work that he kind of employed all of these things into his deep knowledge of Islamic jurisprudence and Islamic history and terminology in a way that I think he did a lot of reviving some of the very profound terms that you can find in Islamic jurisprudential politics, you can say, or the Islamic jurisprudence of politics, siyasa shar'iyya in a sense. They have multiple translations for such, field. But so one of the things that he in the book emphasized is that one of the things that they always say is sometimes التحلية قبل التخلية or التخلية قبل التحلية, meaning that to empty the bottle before you fill it with something. You empty the bottle from the bad thing before you fill it with good things. So he said he tried to kind of refute some of the misconceptions, and one of the main misconceptions is what we just mentioned, which is about the theocracy or dawla diniya, and whether that, and the difference between dawla diniya and dawlat al-Muslimin or dawla al-Islamiyya or whatever you want to call it. And that theocracy was just a pure product of context and a certain environment that never existed in Islamic history and was never needed in Islamic history. And we had a different experiment and we developed some kind of different, of course, complications and problems, but never this. I mean, this was never part of the issue, at least in a certain context, or to an extent, at least, in our history. So this was one thing that he tried to talk about, and then he delved into the issue of democracy, of the state of accountability, and whether and how and touched the very sensitive issue in Islamic history and Islamic jurisprudence and the siyasa shar'iyya, which is the concept of wali al-amr and wulat al-amr and ta'at wali al-amr and al-khuruj ala wali al-amr, and whether and he made it so clear that al-nasiha was an obligation. It's not a part of khuruj, and when you give advice, when you speak against oppressions, it's not part of khuruj. It's actually an obligation. it's an Islamic obligation upon everybody according to their capacity and depending on their will and how they can do this. And he also made it clear in another part of the book that also that absolute authority of the ruler was never part of Islamic jurisprudence, was never part of Islam. Nothing in Islam at all that gives the ruler this absolute authority at all. There's nothing. God is the only absolute, authority on this earth, and everybody else, including rulers, even legitimate rulers, let alone those who their legitimacy is always questionable, has the ultimate authority and the absolute authority, and he went into discussions of some of the very common used hadiths to justify tyranny and justify authoritarianism. And he discussed the famous example of وَلَوْ جَلَدَ ظَهْرَكَ وَأَخَذَ مَالَكَ أطع الأمير ولو جلد ظهرك وأخذ مالك. And he actually concluded that this hadith is actually weak and ضعيف, is never verified or inauthentic basically. And he said that, and he went into two parts of the hadith, the sanad, which is the chain of the hadith, and he discussed that, and then he went to the matan of the hadith, which is the text of this tradition and saying of the Prophet, and he said it actually contradicts basic understanding of Islam and so many hadiths and so many other verses of Quran that actually was so clear in saying that. And there's actually another hadith that is much more authentic that says من قتل دون أرضه فهو شهيد من قتل دون ماله فهو شهيد. So how come the Prophet said that whoever protects his land, and even if this comes to him being killed or her being killed, this is part of they are announced as martyrs. So he said, how come this same Prophet ﷺ would say in this alleged hadith that وَلَوْ جَلَدَ ظَهْرَكَ وَأَخَذَ مَالَكَ, even if the ruler would beat your back and take your money. This has nothing to do with the basic understanding of Islam, the relationship between the ruler and the ruler. And he talked about the concept of bay'ah, and I think I remember even the old transcript of the book when he talked about bay'ah, and we discussed that extensively. And he even went further in another occasion in explaining more about what the concept of bay'ah is and the relationship between the rule and the ruler. And he talked about the bay'ah is like a contract, and a contract in Islam should be upheld by both parties equally. And he talked about the relationship between and also the rights of the people, and how is this is part of I hope I'm not talking too much, but you get the idea of the sense of the book generally, and how what we are.
I think you've done a great job in sort of giving us an idea of exactly, specifically, actually, some of the debates that he was looking at in the course of the book. And I have to actually admit myself, I didn't know if I've mentioned this to you, but I actually did. I've written a book chapter on sort of your father's, on this book in particular. That I actually wrote a piece looking at the way in which your father engages the hadith which you mentioned, where it says, and this is it's quite striking that he says it's weak, because of course it's in Sahih Muslim, and so he spends some time to explain why it's reasonable to say that it's weak, that he's not the first person to have called it weak. He mentions two scholars in particular.
Just to add to this, he has an interesting really take, because he was really trained as a muhaddith, as a person who is specialized in hadith actually, and his masters and PhD were on hadith. So he's a muhaddith, and he said I worked a lot on this hadith, and he said actually the the warden of وَإِنْ جَلَدْ ظَهْرَكَ وَأَخَذَ مَالَكَ is an addition that would never appeared in any of Muslims' hadith. It's not part of the hadith Muslim. It was an addition that was added to the original hadith.
Right.
So that was an interesting take also.
Right.
Even to clarify that a lot of people will take the original hadith and will just use this addition as part of the hadith that was authenticated by Muslim. But he said clearly he went to every Muslim, and he also, by the way, did a commentary on Muslims. So he said there was this addition is mudraj, what's called mudraj.
Interesting.
So it was never part of the original hadith.
Interesting. Okay, well, I mean, so I've heard, for example, Yusuf al-Khaladawi, and incidentally, I've put in echo cancellation, so hopefully you don't need to worry about that echo anymore. But Yusuf al-Khaladawi also commented on this hadith, saying that he argued that this is from the hadith. It's not of the hadith al-usul, right? It's the mutaba'at, and so the mutaba'at have a slightly different status. They can have some weakness, etc. But the notion that it's mudraj, which is to say a kind of interpolation on the part of someone else, is quite, in a sense, that's a bit of a daring statement, I would say. But of course, I mean, as you say, your father is a muhaddith. He's someone who's dedicated his life to the study of hadith and studied with some very eminent scholars. So, you know, if anyone has the right to say these sorts of things, it's obviously an eminently qualified scholar like your father. In that sort of chapter that I've written, it should be coming out in a few months' time with in a volume on Salafism with Edinburgh University Press. But I also compare his take with Muhammad al-Hasan al-Dado, which is slightly different. And I basically say, look, Muhammad al-Hasan al-Dado, he basically takes his hadith and he says it's sahih, but then he basically says that, look, it obviously doesn't mean the way it's being used. It can't possibly mean that, because of the same reasons your father gives in the book, actually, which are that, you know, this is, it contradicts hadiths which are mutawatir, which are, you know, unequivocal and also, in a sense, definitive. They're at a level of transmission that cannot be contested, such as the hadith that you mentioned, man qutila duna malihi fahuwa shahid. Whoever fights and defends their wealth and is killed for it, meaning they're trying to protect their wealth and they die in the process, they're considered to be martyrs. So how can that conflict with?
And to balance this hadith with other, like all other hadiths, like to prevent these rules from aggression. And he said, if you're gonna follow the hadith, then you should follow also these other hadith that. في آخر الزمان الذي يأتون معهم سياط يجلدون الناس لا يريحون رائحة الجنة. The other hadith that talked about you know the الظلم, النهي عن الظلم.
سيد الشهداء حمزة ورجل قام إلى. I mean, he mentions all of those hadiths as well. You can sort of you're aware of all these hadiths, obviously, that your father mentions.
And also in Quran, talking about رد الظلم الظالمين والنهي عن الظلم.
Yes. يعني he quotes the verse.
فيها ففسقوا فيها فحق عليها القول فدمرناها تدميرا. The other verses. Yeah.
He mentions the verse of Ibrahim alayhi salam saying that وَمِن ذُرِّيَّتِي, right? قال لا ينال عهد الظالمين. Like, you know, if you can remember the beginning of the verse, ربي إني إني جاعلك للناس إماما, right? And so Ibrahim asks, what about my children? Can they also be the leaders of their communities? And he said, only the people who are not ظالمين, basically. And so, yeah, I mean, this is what's really powerful about this book. It's a short book, you mentioned. It's a lot shorter than a lot of his books, but it's extremely rich. I mean, it's very murakkaz, to use an Arabic term. It's very focused on a whole host of very sensitive issues in the context in which he's writing, right?
Yeah, true.
So I wonder, I mean, this might be a bit of a sort of awkward question, and you can feel free to decline, but to what extent is this book responsible for his imprisonment, do you think?
Well, I think it is partly responsible, because when you read the charges, it's obviously come up in the first page of the Attorney General's memo against him in court. He said, and absolutely the first charge was spreading corruption on earth by inciting rebellion against the kingdom and inciting rebellion against legitimate rulers. And then, and then went on to mention his works. And then they said, write in a book on revolution in which he invites people to rebel, which
But
he never like.
This is literally the opposite of what he does in the book, right?
Exactly.
So, right in the outset of the book, he's saying, revolution is something which is undesirable, and it's not something that you want to bring about. So you should do what is necessary to prevent it from happening by, creating that space and freedoms for people and so on. So that people can.
True. I found the historians once summarizes my father's position, saying that revolutions are always impossible until they happen, and when they happen, they are inevitable. So what my father says exactly is that he said, "I'm against revolutions, and because I'm against revolutions, I'm for eliminating the reasons." That lead to revolutions, and these reasons are oppression, and I'm against oppression. I'm against tyranny. I'm against absolute rule. I'm against authoritarianism. I'm against arbitrary detention. I'm against all these things that lead to revolutions.
Yes.
But if you are doing these things, well, you are inviting revolutions. You are the callers for revolutions. And when they call him, you are da'iyat thawra, he said, no, a thawra has no callers, has no du'at other than oppression, authoritarianism, and dictatorship. And that's absolutely true.
Absolutely. I mean, this is the tragic irony, of course. And, I usually think of these sorts of circumstances where they're bringing out these desperate arguments to try and sort of discredit your father. And the sort of the desperation of the arguments and the incoherence of them reflects the fact that this is purely a matter of autocracy trying to assert itself and not having any actual arguments to support itself or buttress its sort of position. And I think, despite the massive dhulm, the massive tyrannical oppression that your father is facing, and we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to accept that in the fi kifati hasanatihi. But he has, just by writing a book like this, I think really forced these institutions to recognize their own corruption and their own tyranny. And there's a fascinating quote from Tacitus. I get this from Noam Chomsky, who likes this quote. He says, a crime once exposed has no refuge except in audacity, so in waqaha. And so, that's the nature of this kind of aggression against one of the great reformers of Saudi, one of the great sort of callers to a more open society and greater freedoms for people, but at the same time, unfortunately, he's being repressed in that way.
Yeah, and talking about tyranny, I remember like one charge of his is that he called the Saudi government tyrannical and accusing the Saudi government of monopolizing wealth. I don't know how these are charges at all.
Yeah. I mean, what's striking for me in your father's book is how measured the tone is, right? I mean, he doesn't actually... He says, look, I'm not writing about any specific place, right?
True.
And he's trying to actually create an environment where there can be dialogue and discussion, rather than have a situation where, he certainly isn't someone who's standing up and saying, you're a tyrannical government and we need to change you. He never says anything like this. He wants us to reflect and think about what can we do to reform our societies, because that's the first step. And to accuse him of doing those sorts of things.
Yeah, I mean, it's true, and I mean, the thing is that I think one of the things that they fear the most about him is that his tone, that he is not just well respected in the scholastic circles and all that, but also He's very well popular among the youths and the young people
Right.
in the Muslim and Arab world, and in Saudi Arabia in particular. And
Right.
given the fact, just the basic fact that he is being followed by 14 million followers,
Right.
many of them are inside Saudi Arabia. Just imagine the whole population of Saudi Arabia is like the Saudis is about
Right.
like 19 or 18 million people.
Right.
Uh,
Right.
at least half of them, basically.
Right, right, right. I mean, it's
So,
quite conceivable that half of the country are his followers on
which is
Twitter.
double than what the king has been followed.
Right, right. I mean, I believe is he the? I'm not sure if he's the most followed in Saudi, but he's one of the most followed in Saudi.
Yes, for
I
sure.
mean, Saudi Arabia has the highest one of the highest Twitter concentrations of Twitter users in the world, and this
Sure,
is
yeah.
why, I mean, unfortunately, they've tried to create these
Manipulated.
Twitter farms.
Yeah, Twitter bots and automated
Yes,
accounts and fake,
yeah,
trolls and propaganda.
right,
And then they have been doing that a lot. And I think they have done one of also. I think that's why also part of why they targeted my father. The tweets that he wrote, and also that tweet about
reconciliation between brotherly sort of
yes,
states. Yes,
true. So they think. I remember like few times that the king would pick up the phone and call my father over a
oh,
tweet. Yeah, they would urge him to delete a tweet or change the tone of a tweet.
right,
They know how much influence and effect
right, right.
Twitter, and even my father's Twitter account specifically, had and has, and that's why they take it seriously.
I, one of the things that obviously, autocracies in this way can exercise the violence of the state, and actually be sort of given a free hand by the international community to do so. Unfortunately, there's not been much of a response, and one of the things that I wonder is, once they have, your father's been imprisoned now since 2017 September. We're coming on to nearly 4 years of this.
Yeah.
He's been tortured and put in conditions that are, amount to torture themselves. But in addition to that, he's been subject to torture,
And he
and
has been the whole time in solitary confinement.
which is recognised by the international community as a
Yeah,
by international institutions and as a form of torture.
true.
And I mean, it's really. I feel for your father, and I ask Allah Subhanahu wa Taala to ease things for him.
Um,
My question is, what can be done for the cause of reform in a place like Saudi Arabia in this context? And I don't know if you can perhaps connect it to the ideas that he talks about in this book. And perhaps this is a great opportunity to hear about the sorts of work that you're doing right now in that initiative, so to speak.
well, first of all, I think one of the things that has been doing is connecting with everybody, every aspect of society, in order to reach the common goal of reform, of having tranquility, of having fair and just society and just system. And I think one of the things that we can do, and we are doing, alhamdulillah, and I think we're succeeding so far, is opening our arms to everybody, regardless of their background, of their
Right.
what they have done and what they are doing. As long as we can do the right thing, and I'm following his footstep uh, throughout his work. And like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in Surah Al-Ma'idah says, وَتَعَاوَنُوا عَلَى الْبِرِّ وَالتَّقْوَى.
Right.
تعاونوا على البر والتقوى. Bir is the good deeds, and taqwa is piety. And piety always with people who you share their religious values, but good deeds or al-bir with people who you usually don't share, or you don't necessarily share religious values with.
Right. And just for the sort of viewers who are unfamiliar with Arabic, it's a verse that calls people to work together towards things which are for positive causes, and you're saying that these two components that are mentioned towards bir and towards taqwa are reflections of both, in a sense, people who aren't necessarily themselves particularly virtuous. You're still sort of like treating them, working with them, and taqwa are people who reflect a kind of piety and virtue that God speaks highly of. So that's how you're understanding this?
Yes.
Right, fantastic.
So that's one thing. And the other thing is that also when we talk about, when we talk about reform, we always consumed in the moment. And we are just making our enemies succeed if we just respond, reactively instead of proactively. So it's good that we react into one here and here and one here and there. It's good that we are covering, whatever atrocity is being done here or there. But it's even much better to have a plan, an overall plan of what we do generally, and helping not just the cases that we care about, but the cases that we usually don't care about or care less, or we started, or at least we start caring more about things that don't come to our lab easily, but we make an effort.
Can you give an example, perhaps, of?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I'll give you a quick example. There is a case of a royal, for example, believe it or not, that who was mistreated. He never held a public office, but he was mistreated. He was tortured. He was slapped in the face by people of the state security, and I think helping such person sends a strong message to everybody, including the royal family, that it's not personal. It's not against the family. It's not against an institution. It's not against. It's against behavior that this people now. Against the behavior of people who are now holding power in the country.
Right.
And it's just a way of also purifying ourselves, trying to defend those who are different, who are usually have every reason to distance yourself from. We kind of also, I'm kind of also teaching myself and going beyond my own,
comfort zone, as it were.
Exactly.
Yes. I think this is, you make a fascinating point, because even the language that Muslims will use in thinking about reform is very often deeply religious, deeply coloured by our own sort of belief system. And so when we say things like we want to purify ourselves, and we're thinking even that sort of phrase needs a kind of translation for a non-Muslim or less religious sort of context, because purify yourself of what? Oh, of sins. And it's deeply embedded within a metaphysic where the Prophet, says in a hadith, prophetic statement that كل بني آدم خطاء وخير الخطائين التوابون, that all of the children of Adam are in the state of sin, and the best of the sinners are those who constantly return to God in repentance. So I think
my father talked a lot about training ourselves, and one of the main things that he talked about is we always remember to train ourselves physically. We always remember to pray, to force ourselves to do things that we don't want to do physically. But he said the most important and most difficult part is that mental and psychological training of trying to accept and trying to read things and trying to open our minds to things that we don't think we can do, and trying to see things from fair and justice perspective instead of what they have done to me or what they have done to my family, or
Right. And this is just another extraordinary dimension of the book, in a sense, in that he's not really hung up on the fact that he's been mistreated by the state for years, right? I mean, it's just been, the story of his life. He's not interested in that. He's interested in, okay, what can we do to work together towards what is good? We can work in partnership with people. And that's something that's conveyed in the sort of, I feel that in the text as well. There's this conciliatory note to all parties and this effort to try and create conditions of mutual understanding between the hakim and the mahkum, so to speak, to use the Arabic term, the ruler and the ruled. And I think that this is just, there's a kind of Mandela quality to it, to use an expression that will make sense to, I think, a lot of people in the West. I pray that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives him, freedom before long.
Yeah, I remember like one aspect of his that he presented at multiple occasions. Speaking of these terms that of these concepts that come from the value and the idea of repentance. I remember him talking once about the collective repentance, and he said, "You of course repent from a sin that is individualistic in nature, but that collective repentance is from not an individualistic sin, but from a collective sin, from a societal sin." And he said, societal sins are much more influential and deeper, and have deeper influence in every aspect of society. And he gave examples of these things. He said, tyranny is one of these sins, and also violence, being violent against each other, being, these sins, being backward, being less advanced, or less, caring about how to get the most interest of how to protect the interests of society and the public interest and all of these things. So yeah.
I mean, so this is actually sort of reflective of the hadith of the Prophet, where it says, talking about the children of Israel, that they stopped doing amr bil ma'ruf and nahy anil munkar, right? So they, and this is a theme that runs through your father's book as well, but the idea that you have a situation where people will see other people perpetrating things which are harmful for society, and initially they'll go and say, oh, you shouldn't do this, and then they basically stop doing that, and they just ignore the fact that people are doing things which are wrong. And in a sense, that is a harmful shift in society, that you're beginning to tolerate these sorts of harmful practices. He mentions that amr bil ma'ruf and nahy anil munkar is one of these core components in a Muslim society, that just to translate it, the idea of enjoining good things and prohibiting bad things, what Michael Cook calls in his enormous monograph on the topic, Commanding Right and Forbidding Wrong. I wonder if you can comment briefly on the way in which that relates perhaps to also tyranny and the hakim. And perhaps this can be the last comment we make before we go on to the questions. I understand a few people have questions as well. So, yeah.
Yeah. You mean the relationship between tyranny and...
So amr bil ma'ruf and nahy anil munkar as a way of sort of combating tyranny of the sort.
Yeah, absolutely. He talked a lot about the value of this virtue of amr bil ma'ruf and nahy anil munkar, and he tried to counterbalance that concept that was overused by supporters of tyranny and those who try to justify tyranny through the concept of ta'at walil amr, obedience to the ruler. So he tried to first question that concept of obedience to the ruler by saying, like, what ruler? It has to be legitimate. There are always conditions on the ruler being ruler, and it's a contract between two parties that have to be equal. and every one of them has to uphold their part of the bargain and all these things. It's not one-way street and all of these things. And then he counterbalanced the whole concept with another concept, which is much more rooted concept in Islam, to the degree that a lot of the ulama said it's a rukn arkan Islam, in a sense that it's
one of
more
the pillars
societal
of
than
the faith.
individualistic. Yes, one of the pillars of Islam, in the sense that it is more. And this is the way, by the way, how Mu'tazila developed that into making it really part of their pillars of aqidah, of their doctrine, rather than just practice. As you know, they have the 5 pillars of that
Mu'tazili,
right. Of the doctrine of Mu'tazila.
Right.
Anyway, so in al-amr bil ma'ruf and nahy anil munkar, and by the way, I really think we should translate it into commanding at least the common right and forbidding the common wrong, or something that can reflect that ma'ruf munkar rather than khair shar.
Yes, you're absolutely right. It's tough, yeah.
Yeah, in one verse, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala distinguishes between ma'ruf and khair, and both being translated into English as good, which is very confusing. Like, وَلْتَكُنْ مِنْكُمْ أُمَّةٌ يَدْعُونَ إِلَى الْخَيْرِ وَيَأْمُرُونَ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ. So he said, يَدْعُونَ إِلَى الْخَيْرِ, call for the good, وَيَأْمُرُونَ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ, and commanding the common.
What is commonly known, like what is a shared value of understanding as good. Yes, ma'ruf is very specific, as you know.
Yeah, so it is. And also Mawardi, although you can disagree on whatever you want on with al-Mawardi on multiple things, but he says great things about how ma'ruf is ma'ruf, and the condition of ma'ruf to be ma'ruf, and what are the things that you can command. It's not just khair, it's ma'ruf.
Where does he say this?
Specific in his book Ahkam al-Sultaniyya, right.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll comment on Mawardi in just a moment, but I don't know if you wanted to finish the point.
That's the point.
Okay, yes. I mean, you said, it's an interesting thing that you say, that, whatever you think of Mawardi, I actually think very highly of Mawardi, and this is where I find myself disagreeing with a lot of, scholars scholars kind of reacting to al-Ahkam Sultaniyya. And I personally think that Noah Feldman's interpretation of, Mawardi's move, and actually I've kind of seen this in Khaladawi. I can't seem to find the reference, but Khaladawi described him as, also making a very wise choice under the circumstances. The Imarat al-Istila, which is what everyone complains about with respect to Mawardi, the idea that so the notion that, okay, well, we're going to normalize the conquering political power, right? So everyone complains that
Mawardi
basically, and this goes in the Western tradition to H.A.R. Gibb. Sorry.
They would say he justifies the status quo.
Precisely. So Mawardi basically says that, by legitimating I think it was the Buwayhids or something like this, I can't remember exactly whom he was legitimating at his time. Actually, no, this is the Salajiqa. So by legitimating the Seljuks, he's basically saying that there's no such thing as principle in politics, it's just power. And Noah Feldman very helpfully, and this is something which is now widely accepted, Patricia Corona and various other scholars have noted this in their work, they basically say, look, this is actually his way of preserving the dominance of the ulama. Because what he's done is, he said, okay, we normalize the situation, civil society is still in our hands. We control the judiciary, we control education, we control various institutions, the mosques and all this stuff. Yes, he appoints some judges, but the ulama are in control. By normalizing just some person who's a military commander effectively, they're still dependent on us. We have control. And so this is Noah Feldman. Noah Feldman describes this as a brilliant maneuver in The Fall and Rise of the Islamic State. And I agree. So this is why Yeah, but the way in which
Yeah, I think Mawardi. I mean, there are a few points here. One is that Mawardi was one. I don't think he is completely legitimate, and there are two kind of legitimacy in this context. There is this kind of, you can say, normative legitimacy that they lend on what they think a completely legitimate ruler according to their own, rulings and jurisprudence, which didn't happen in this case. The other kind of legitimacy is the procedural legitimacy, meaning that they kind of accepted the rule and as such just to get these other public interest in their hand, and to make sure that they are protected, and they did, and they succeeded, and it's a totally different concept and dynamics from the modern state. You can't do that now. You didn't have. I mean, you didn't have. It's a totally different thing, because you know better than me that in this, but. You get the idea.
No, I don't know better than you, but I mean, this is something which I'm sure we can benefit from many future conversations, actually. I mean, I have written a brief reflection on this. Inshallah, I mean, if people forget the self-plug, I have a book coming out on Islam and the Arab revolutions in August, and in chapter 9 I basically reflect a little on this debate and kind of critique some of the secondary literature which problematizes this kind of, Mawardi, and not actually Mawardi specifically, but basically effectively says Mawardi justifies the coups and the counter-revolutions and all of these things. And this doesn't make any sense. The reason it doesn't make any sense was beautifully articulated, incidentally, by Khalid Abdul in his Rebellion and Islamic Law, published in 2001. So it's not, sorry, I think it was 2001. So it's not even an original sort of like insight on my part. Khalid al-Fadl says, and this is something which I think a lot of like people who are critiquing this Khuruj doctrine need to understand, in my view. Khalid al-Fadl says that, wait, you can't call someone who advocates the acceptance of the mutaghallib as justifying tyranny, because all he's saying is there's a functional there's a functional legitimacy to having a ruler, and that functional legitimacy is accessible to anyone who can basically take power. So he's actually actively, whether he's saying it's not clear that it's activist or quietist, because that justifies for another Khariji to come and overthrow the ruler, right? At the end of the day, the Khuruj doctrine does legitimate that. The only thing that it says that you shouldn't do is you shouldn't rebel against the ruler and lose, right? That's what it's a prohibition against.
You make sure to succeed when you do it. That's the thing.
Basically. So in any case, I think, to be honest, the medieval scholars, I think, were very intelligent people, and they were, my own. Forgive me, my son seems to be crying.
No, not at all.
And I will, inshallah, help him. My wife is taking care of him for now.
It's fast in rebellion against you.
Alhamdulillah. No, this is rebellion jaiz, right? This is permitted rebellion. Khuruj jaiz. It's not. Because the other point to make is, of course, khuruj is khuruj musallah, and none of these Arab revolutionary sort of protests were initially khuruj musallah. They didn't start off as armed rebellion. In any case, we're going a bit off topic. Actually, it's all on topic, but I wanted you to perhaps take the opportunity to address some of our questions from the viewers, and I wanted to first give say wa alaikum salam to, I don't know how to pronounce that person's name, but he said, Salam, brother Usama Abdullah, wa alaikum salam, inshallah. Ziryab is the person who's asking all the questions, Abdullah, so if it's okay, I'm going to put some of his questions on the screen, and then just, perhaps he can give your reflections, inshallah. Firstly, he says, and he was referring to, I think, our commenting on, the early period. He said, sure, that's the case, but we can't pretend that scholars were sponsored in the Umayyad era to peddle narratives of religious rulings, to justify despots, and whatever they did, they would be saved. So he's saying, you can talk about the problematic scholars in our... I assume, Ziryab, this is what you're saying, but you can talk about the problematic scholars in our own time, but they weren't sponsored in the same way in the historical period to basically be mouthpieces for the government.
Yeah, he's making this, probably the same point from another perspective. I totally agree. That's exactly part of the huge difference, even with the totally different dynamic and systems between the modern system, kind of nation state, and that old old kind of state of governance. If you use halaks,
Right.
yeah, whatever you choose. I mean, these are two different, totally different systems. But the thing is that even with that, they never presented themselves, or actually, they were never. I mean, first of all, there was never something that called mufti, like a position appointed by the state as mufti. That never happened.
ديار الخلافة, so to speak.
Yeah, it's never happened until the 17th or the 16th century,
Right. The Ottoman
where
Empire.
the Ottoman Empire created that, and even with that, it has a totally different context and different.
Not just that. I mean, this is one of the things that I can't remember who I read this in. I think this, yes. So probably Andrew March in his book, The Caliphate of Man. And I don't want to misrepresent Andrew's argument, but the impression that I got was that he was saying, even in the Ottoman, context where they developed all of these systems of the Qanun, so Sulaiman al-Qanuni, an establishment of the legitimacy of state law, meaning the caliph can actually promulgate certain types of laws. These were always subordinated to the Sharia, at the very least on the basis that these qawanin have to realize maslahah. Right? And maslahah is a Shari'i principle. So you're always working within the realm of the Sharia.
Yeah,
and
sure.
Ultimately, in a sense, the Mufti Diyar al-Misriya and the scholarly community have a veto power of a sort on that component.
Yeah, that's exactly, that's the point.
And if I can just add, for people who are afraid of the term Sharia, Anwar Iman in his book Religious Pluralism and Islamic Law, he's a professor of law at the University of Toronto. So he basically says the Sharia should be understood as a rule of law system. So when we're saying it upholds the Sharia, I'm saying upholding the rule of law from an Islamic perspective.
Yeah. Thank you for that clarification. So yeah, that's one thing, and the other thing is that we didn't have that position, and second, they always have that veto power, if you can say it. And thirdly, they were never mouthpieces in a sense that they give fatwas according to the requests of the rulers. They always have their independent schools, independent mosques. They have the freedom to disagree, to say things, to challenge, to so it's a totally different
it's a totally different system, basically. It's a different world.
It's not even comparable in any way.
Now, I mean, I do want to just qualify, because some people say, Muslims have a tendency to over-idealize and so on. And I think, when we say, for example, veto power, they have a veto power. Obviously, it's a conceptual power. It's not, executive power still is in the hand of the... But the thing is, if you think about it, even today, you have a rule of law system in, secular states that haven't been decimated by colonialism, for example. And... the Prime Minister is the, or in the US, the President is the Commander-in-Chief of the military. But if Congress sort of pushes back against him, or if judicial review prevents him from, going through with an executive order, that is veto power. It's built into the institutions, and those are the sorts of things that we're talking about. These are institutionally actually very real. The President might have power, but he actually adheres to these norms. With the exception of Trump last 4 years, but
it's like I think, if I'm not mistaken, in the UK, please correct me if I'm wrong, they call it constitutional conventions. It's like not conventions in the sense that they are written, but rather known, or traditions that have been widely followed.
Yes, I mean the UK, unfortunately, because we have an unwritten constitution, is very, very messy in that regard. So
Yeah.
there are. I'm not an expert on constitutionalism. This is kind of more your kind of legal territory, so to speak. But yeah, I mean, I'd say that one of the things that Brexit has illustrated in the UK, and one of the things that Trump has illustrated in the US, is that all systems and all institutions are ultimately dependent on human beings adhering to those systems. And so, even these systems have their issues. What we're ultimately calling for, really, is that people practice the norms that these systems claim to uphold.
Yeah,
And
true.
and and in the Islamic tradition, you have a 1400-year-old tradition that is older than the Magna Carta. It's older than like all of these habeas corpus and all of these sorts of values that have come to a place of stability in the West, and this is something which is a good thing, right?
Yeah.
Um, why can't we have that in the Islamic, in the Muslim world, in our own sort of voice, without having to bring it in a colonial garb, in a sense?
Yeah,
One of
true.
yeah. I wanted to, sorry, Abdullah, I'm going to put the other two questions that this chap has, and you're, in a sense, the person being asked for a lot of these things, because I'm not as much of an expert on Saudi Arabia. So Ziryab is now asking, so two questions. Let's take one at a time, if that's okay. What are your thoughts on MBS's recent statements on reform? Are you hopeful at all? And perhaps you can connect with that your project with Madawi Rashid and others, Nas, as well.
Yeah. Well, no, no. I'm hopeful in the sense that not because what he said, but because what he didn't say. Because of I always have hope in and believe in the people, and in their convictions. I truly believe that the majority of the, let's say in Saudi Arabia, the majority of the people of Saudi Arabia know the fallacies that MBS presenting, and therefore these so-called reforms, I don't think they are actually. I don't think anybody is taking them seriously, except like what I think a small base of his in Saudi Arabia, and I think he's realizing that, especially in his last interview, where he for sure changed a lot of his positions on a lot of things that I don't think would benefit him at all. From talking about cracking down on what he called the religious establishment, to saying the Quran and Sunnah is our constitution and we are following the Sunnah, but not any Sunnah, the Sunnah that I like, which is the Sunnah that allows me to cut kill dissidents and all these things, according to his own interpretation, of course, but not that Sunnah that wants me to be accountable and hold me accountable and all these things.
Right.
Yeah.
Selective reading. Yeah.
Exactly. So this selective understanding makes you, actually kind of brings light to what he is thinking right now. And also he changed a lot of positions on unemployment, and it shows you that he is realizing that he is in trouble. And I think he knew from, after he was selling a lot of things to the West that a lot of people bought for some times until Khashoggi happened. We knew in advance, of course. My father was arrested like more than a year before that. But a lot of people bought into the narrative of reform until Khashoggi happened. And then after Khashoggi, I don't think anybody would take it seriously. So I don't want to spend a lot of time on...
That's fine. No, I think what you're saying in terms of it seems to indicate a state of weakness on his part.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and so we can, in a sense, take some hope from that. But at the same time, I think all the analysts are probably pricing in the fact that he's here for the long haul, and so it's something which there needs to be a reflection on exactly how we, really create pressures of sorts. We're in an age of states, right? States are the most powerful entities in the world right now.
True, and I think his propagandists changed their position from saying he's a reformer, he's propagating reform and all these things, to he's there. He's the
which is a lot less compelling as a narrative,
exactly,
incidentally, right?
But actually, believe it or not, it sometimes works in the policy circles and all. Because he's there, there's no potential alternative to him. Everybody is eliminated in one way or another. No prince is powerful now. All institutions is in his hand. You have to deal with this guy. So that's now their rhetoric, going all the way from, oh, he's the reformer. So they went probably through 3 stages. One is he's the reformer, he's a good guy, he's your guy among all these rivals and all these things. This kind of didn't work, and especially with Khashoggi was the kind of
the straw that broke the camel's back.
The camel's back. And then the second stage was, oh yeah, he did mistakes, and they kind of tried to reduce Khashoggi and killing people and all these hackings and stuff into mistakes. They said, oh, he makes mistakes, he's a young guy, just allow him to reform and change and all these things. And because also this rhetoric didn't work, because not just he didn't change, he actually got worse. Electrocuting and sexually harassing women, in jail and all these things. And then they went to the third stage. Yeah, we know he's not as good as you want. He's not your guy. But he's there. What do you do? I mean, there's no alternative to him, and he eliminated. And I think to his advantage, you disagree. I disagree on everything with him, but he succeeded in one thing: in the fact that he prepared for this moment of people looking around for alternative. So he tried to eliminate everyone around him, even those who at one point were his loyalists.
Right. I mean, the sad thing for people like him is that nothing lasts forever.
Yeah.
And so
if it lasted forever, he wouldn't be in this position in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, actually, I didn't expect him to be in sort of this sort of position quite so soon. In a sense that he's relatively disempowered, yet the Biden administration has been quite disappointing in a sense. Let's not dwell too much. I'm very conscious of your time. You need to get going, actually. So, do you mind if we take this last question? It's very interesting and one I'm not really in a position to answer. So, let me just read it. I'll show it on the screen. So the question is, how do you understand his statements in light, and this is MBS statements, in light of the fact that reformers like Salman Al-Ouda and Sheikh Hassan Farhan Al-Maliki are still languishing in jail? So this is kind of a takmila for the last question that you asked. Yeah, you were asked.
Well, I think what he did actually when he came to power is that he kind of took from all the people he put in jail some of the ideas that they presented in the past, and he misrepresented them in a way that he took them and he presented them superficially without applying them on the ground, and trying to use them as PR for his PR campaigns and for propaganda and pure politics, without really executing plans that put in place real reforms on the ground. And with these things, he kind of sometimes, let's say, convinced like a group of people, some people. But at the end, when people see that, first of all, I remember how do you say this French historian's name? Tocqueville.
I mean, this is how Americans pronounce it, Tocqueville. But
Tokfi,
it would be
okay.
Tokfi, something like this, I think. Tokfi, rather than, because the LL in French is not pronounced in that way.
Okay,
But
so he said revolutions. Speaking of revolutions, he said revolutions happen when promises of reforms and reforms failed, because they would raise the high expectation of people of change in society and all that, and with these promises, they kind of establish the fact that society as is not enough. We have a lot of problems because that's why we need reform. And when people realize that these reforms failed, this when despair happens, and society, revolts. So I think we are approaching this stage of people knowing that nothing worked so far. And I'm not talking about reforms that I wanted: human rights, democracy, basic liberties, and all these things. State of accountability. No, we're talking about reforms that he presented: the Vision 2030, diversifying the Saudi economy, fighting unemployment rate, and all of these things. It's failing miserably.
right,
We're reaching an unprecedented level of high unemployment rate. The economy is getting worse. Taxation didn't work at all in benefiting, the budget to the economy, but rather benefiting him personally. And people kind of started seeing that, building palaces for him and his father, rather than building projects and real projects that can benefit people and employ citizens. So we get in approaching this point, I think.
Sheikh Abdullah, I hope that you will, keep on working in these sorts of arenas that you're concerned with, in terms of political reform in Saudi Arabia, social reform as well. And in a sense, I place hope in someone like yourself. Like 10, 20 years from now, put the good fight in right now. 10, 20 years from now, if there are opportunities, to go back to Saudi and be there in person to assist in the reform, this is, we need these people to be able to do that. Obviously, right now it's just not safe. And this is
maybe in a few years from now.
Even a few years from now, inshallah, maybe it'll be safe and you can actually be there on the ground calling for reform. This is the way in which I think these governments work. They exile people and disempower them. But I really admire the project that you and so many other Saudis have come together to do, NAS. Do you want to conclude perhaps by talking briefly about the NAS project?
Yeah.
Inshallah.
So the NAS project, basically, in brief, it's a project that a group of Saudis from various backgrounds and diverse, backgrounds decided to take on, and we gathered from the south, north, and central parts of Saudi Arabia, from whether Shia or Sunni, liberals and Islamists, women and men, and all these people, in order to form. And we started first with kind of national dialogue that we never had, in what we want in our society and what we aspire for and all these things. And we knew that what we know, and there are common interests and common values in trying to have a better future for Saudi Arabia. And we agreed on the basic elements of calling for democracy, freedom, accountability, diversity, protection of basic rights in Saudi Arabia. And we started the party of the National Assembly Party, a group of people that I think we are in different parts of the world. Everybody has links to academia, to institutions, policymakers, decision makers, and think tanks, whether in the UK, in Canada, here in the US, in Australia, New Zealand. We have people of course, in Ireland. We have people in Germany. Believe it or not, in the Arab world, and of course we have people inside the country. But of course we keep them as people, as we call them, unnamed members of the party, just to keep them safe and protected. So this is basically the project that we started, and we announced on the Saudi National Day, September 23rd. And in next September, we're going to have hopefully a big event.
Inshallah. No, I find these efforts of people like yourself an inspiration, people like yourself, Madawi, and various others, an inspiration to those of us who really want to see greater sort of reform, political reform in the region and in the world more generally. And as'alullah laka tawfiq wa sadad. May Allah grant you success in these initiatives. And I hope, inshallah, that you will join me at some point in the future. We'll have further conversations, whether on your father's writing or your own writings for that matter. But with that, I'd like to thank Shaykh Dr. Abdullah Alaoudh for giving us actually an hour and 15 minutes of his time after I actually requested an hour. So you've been very generous with us. And I want to let viewers also know that, inshallah, next week we're going to have Imam Omar Suleiman, a Palestinian scholar in the United States, who is also a great campaigner and activist for social justice issues and global justice issues. And he's recently written a book on that theme. So inshallah, please do join us. And Shaykh Abdullah, if you're able to join, please do, inshallah. But until then, I look forward to staying in touch. And
absolutely. Thank you so much for inviting me.
It's been my pleasure. Fi amanillah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.